we go.
Sorry.
No, thanks for interrupting. All good. If you guys need to interrupt, then please feel free to. I'd rather just have questions in the middle if you're wondering anything rather than waiting till the end and you might forget what you wanted to ask. So feel free to jump in anytime. Yeah, so we're focusing on breaking down pedagogical approaches to literacy. And I know that can sometimes sound like, what does that mean? I don't know really what a pedagogical approach is, but an easy way to think of it is that it's the how. So when we think about curriculum outcomes, that's our what, that's the what we're teaching. And when we think about pedagogical approaches, it's the how are you going to teach it, which we're actually going to talk a little bit about today. And you're going to investigate a couple of literacy approaches. So the how you teach it, is it going to be through a modelled reading approach or a shared reading or independent reading? How is the actual lesson going to be structured? We're going to have a look at the planning, obviously with Victorian and curriculum outcomes and using specific content descriptors in literacy. So it's important to understand the structure of Victorian curriculum, which breaks down into the strands of reading and writing and speaking and listening, but also various substrands underneath each of those headings, and understanding that there's the substrands of also literacy and literature and language as well. Because we're talking about lesson planning, we also have to talk about assessment, and we also have to talk about differentiation, because we need to know if there was a real lesson that we wanted to implement, say on a prac, then we need to know where the kids are at. We need to know what's our starting point in terms of what the kids already know. So that there's also some sort of assessment that's going to be happening, say, before your particular lesson, during, and potentially after. Effective assessment needs to happen so that you can differentiate, so that you are providing different learning activities for different people in your grade. So when you're doing your lesson plan, but also your unit plan as well. A lot of these are going to relate to our unit planner that we're making as well, which is assessment 2. We need to be able to not have everybody doing the same task. So in a typical classroom grade, even in my 3-4 grade at the moment, the range is huge. So we've got couple of little ones who are still probably foundation level for reading, all the way up to some kids who are ahead, so say grade 5, 6 level. So you're pretty much dealing with the whole scope of, all of those primary levels. Not to say that our lesson's going to involve something that detailed, but we do need to consider different academic groups and different elements of inclusion as well. And we'll talk about what that means. When we talk about reading and we're talking about early literacy, obviously we need to talk about phonics, and we need to talk about how you actually teach kids to read. And we're going to have a look at some literature which is interesting to me because it talks about the science of reading, and probably moving away a little bit from a whole language approach, which we'll find out more about in our reading as well, in that Winch textbook. We can talk more about that later. We're focusing on comprehension because the ultimate goal of reading is to be able to comprehend. We spent 2 weeks looking at writing as well. So we've got writing approaches and a genre study, and our main aims of those first 2 assessments is to look at lesson and unit planning. So that's a little bit of an overview on how the unit is going to work. So we start off this week doing a unit overview, but I didn't want to just have a discussion about the unit and then sort of end it there, just because time's really precious with that week 4 due date. So I really want to use the time today as well to start looking at that assessment and start looking at pedagogical approaches. So we're going to do a little bit of that today too. Week 2 is all about curriculum and planning and assessment, and that's all sort of planning cycle of how you get ready to plan different lessons and different sort of unit planners. In week 3 and 4, we're focusing on reading. In week 5 and 6, we're focusing on writing, with our lesson plan and unit plan being due in between there. When I hand you your unit plan, we'll put some specific dates in there. I'm just working them out with Rach at the moment. You guys have got your placement, so we'll have a bit of a break between 7 and 9, but then when we come back, we'll be talking about assessment, record keeping. You'll have your second placement. Connecting to ICT, which is super important because everything we do these days is connected to ICT, and there's a strong ICT focus within literacy and how you can use that to your benefit when planning lessons for, all sorts of literacy lessons. And our presentations are in week 13. In the unit planner, we have our assessment 1 lesson planning document. So it looks a little bit like this. I'll just move it over a little bit so you can see a bit better. This is due in week 4, and like I said, we'll get you a specific date. I'll talk to Rach today about these dates in week 4 when it will be due. I'll be pushing for perhaps something end of week 4, just to give us that little bit of extra time to work through some of the things that we need to cover by then. 30% of your grade, it is an individual task, and it's the equivalent to 1,200 words, and we're focusing on the learning outcomes that are 1, 2 and 3, which are in our unit planner, talking about frameworks, talking about how to compose a literacy planning document, and we're going to investigate diverse ways to assess, record and monitor literacy skills. In the chat, or perhaps even raise a hand, how much experience have you guys had with lesson planning so far? Have you had a go at it on a prac? Just, if you've never done one, let me know. It's just, I'd like to get a bit of a gauge on how you guys are feeling, just so I'm not talking about too much, perhaps stuff you guys already know. Not much. Okay, great. All different. Yeah, okay, Rach. Okay, so most people are probably maybe had a go, maybe at different times, perhaps on a prac they've had a go at writing a lesson plan. Maybe, as we said, not too specific to literacy though. I can show you a lesson plan that I've actually got. To say that it's going to be the same for this one, we don't actually have a template to use. They haven't given us a template. So how we want it to look could potentially be up to us, which is nice. This assessment requires you to submit a literacy lesson plan suitable for the primary context years, Foundation 1 and 2, for a 1-hour session. So you're thinking about a 1-hour, 60-minute session. So you are going to have to choose either a reading or writing focus. You won't be able to do both of those in that time. When you get to your unit planner, which is the second one, you'll do your whole literacy block. So you'll be planning for both. But this is just one. It's actually really nice to have the lesson plan first, which is a good sort of stepping stone then to the unit planner. The lesson plan should reflect evidence-based theoretical frameworks, which we'll talk about, and must provide, include a provision for differentiation, which we also talked about. The lesson should be guided by literacy data, so we need to have some sort of pre-assessment that is driving our teaching so that we know where we're starting from. And you are expected to provide example data and a brief analysis. You will explain how the data will influence your lesson design and implementation. You should also include links to curriculum frameworks, naturally, classroom learning experiences, classroom resources, and notes on critical reflection. You will reference the set text, which is Winch. So I've got a hard copy here because I've used it at Swinburne before. I'll get you, I think it says in the unit plan that that one's our e-text, but if you're having trouble accessing that one, let me know, or you're not sure what it is. I think it's written in our unit outline, which we'll get out today. So we need at least one academic reference, but probably to do a really good job of that, you'd need to have more than it says at least one. The way the lesson plan, what we could do is get one up just for you to have a quick look over. Let me see my recents. Computer's very slow. All right, now this is not to say that this is what our lesson plan will end up looking like, but I just thought it would be nice to be able to perhaps talk to an example, just in case you haven't had much to do with lesson planning before, but also literacy planning more specifically. So this is one that was a previous submission that I had, which I thought would be nice to have a look at because it has things like what the unit objectives are, but more importantly, I don't think we need to worry too much about other curriculum links, but what the curriculum links are to the particular assessment. Now, these are Australian curriculum links, so we're going to use the Victorian curriculum, but we do need to have specific learning outcomes that we are going to connect to. So you'll need to be able to go into the Victorian curriculum, which we'll talk about today as well, and find particular outcomes that you're going to connect to. So over the next few weeks, we'll need to make a decision about what, firstly, are you going to do a reading or writing lesson? And then secondly, what sort of avenues within the Victorian curriculum you're going to look at. So it could be more of a comprehension focus. It could be more of, say, writing with different genres. This one is about, it's an hour lesson on, say, the writing process and understanding verbs and teaching verbs. Within this particular lesson, they've highlighted which teaching strategies that we're going to use. So they've highlighted things like the shared reading is the way that their lesson is going to start off with modelling and thinking aloud, as well as independent reading from the students. They've got an area for feedback, an area for assessment strategies, and broken them into formative and summative. You don't need to include formative and summative, but you can have just as an example of how it could be structured. And then it gets into the actual body of the lesson itself. So in our lesson, it's important to have some sort of introduction where we'll talk more about that modelled and shared reading today and what it actually involves, and how the most important thing with lesson planning is how you're linking it back to your Victorian curriculum outcomes. So I think that's the most important thing with lesson planning, is how well have you been able to teach the outcomes that you've chosen. So if you've decided to choose that you're going to have a look at a particular comprehension strategy, how well has the lesson actually addressed that particular content descriptor? With content descriptors, it's really beneficial just to be very, very explicit. You don't want to choose too many for your lesson plan. You just want to keep it really specific. So if your focus is on verbs, don't add a whole lot of other CDs that are going to make your lesson very sort of jumbled and tricky to read and tricky to teach. If you were in a classroom and you just had the 1 hour, you don't want to be trying to cover a whole lot of different content descriptors. And it's really hard for the kids too, because if you're trying to teach too many things, firstly, it's hard to write learning intentions and it's hard to write success criteria if your curriculum standards are very broad. If you keep it just to say 2 or 1 or 2 things that you want to achieve in that lesson and keep it really, really explicit, your lesson will be easier to write. And then when it comes to teaching something in the body of your lesson, like we have here, it's easier to come up with activities, it's easier to come up with ideas, because you'll know my focus is verbs and that's what I'm teaching, and this is how I'm going to teach it, and this is how I'm going to assess it. So we want an introduction to the lesson, some sort of middle activity that the kids are going to do with your differentiation in there, showing what different kids are going to be doing, and then some sort of ending. This particular student has come up with different things that different groups are going to do, and then some sort of ending to wrap up the lesson. So that was just an example of a lesson I had. What we can do potentially next week or the week after is discuss how we want our lesson plan to look and what could be our headings and what we could include in ours. Our next task . Yeah, I think we can, absolutely, just make your own. Good question, Jess. If we talk about it in our shoot next week, and we could talk about lots of different lesson plan templates, and you might say, oh, I really like that one, I'm going to use that one. So everyone's could be a little bit different. It's really good when the assessment sort of criteria is open and we don't have to all sort of follow a particular format. With assessment 2, it is the unit planner, and unit plans are a little bit trickier to write because we probably feel like we want to include a lot more detail than we can. So it's hard to be succinct. That's what I've found when I've marked unit plans in the past from pre-service teachers. It's hard to be succinct. So it's a particular skill that we have to learn. And you might be saying to yourself, wow, how am I going to write a whole unit plan and I've only got 1,200 words? So that's what I mean by being sort of really succinct about what things you can include. So see how super detailed that lesson plan was. Our unit plan is not going to be like that. You can't include all of those things from your unit plan from your lesson plan into a unit plan. It just wouldn't work. And I hate to say it, but teachers don't do lesson plans, and we don't do lesson plans like that because they're just too long and we don't have time. So a unit planner is probably the more practical of the two. You might want to still write lesson plans in your first year out because you need that kind of structure and you need the depth. But as you progress in your career, the unit plan's where it's at. That's what you're going to be using. So in this particular task now, my concern is that that's due 2 weeks later. So we're probably going to need to be perhaps talking about 2 things when this one gets a little bit closer. The assessment requires you to submit 5 days, so 5 days in the week. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of your lessons would be one after the other, but we just assume that it's a sequence of learning of 5 lessons. And it's going to be a planning document suitable for the levels foundation 1 or 2. So that's a really good point that I probably forgot to talk about with the first one is you're choosing your grade level. So choose a grade level. If you want to choose foundation for your lesson plan, but then you would like to change it to grade 2 for your unit plan, that's probably really good for you because it will give you it'll give you the benefit of having exposure to more of the content descriptors. If you want to keep it the same, because you might say to yourself, look, I've chosen foundation for my lesson plan and I really just want to keep going with the foundation outcomes. I feel like I know them pretty well now. I feel like I can use them. I feel like I understand them. Then you might want to keep going. But the decision's totally up to you, whether you want to keep it the same, whether you want to change it up and learn some new content descriptors for this one. It is totally up to you. But we do need to keep it in the levels foundation 1 or 2. So it is early years, which is fun anyway. So we're going to have a weekly program planner, and it's going to be this time the daily 2-hour literacy block for the week. So this time we need to plan the whole block. It is not as detailed as a lesson plan, and I'm glad that they've said that there. However, it should follow a logical sequence and each day build upon the learning from the previous lesson. So this takes a little bit more thought than a standalone lesson. When we were planning a standalone lesson and we said, wow, I've just decided to do a lesson on verbs and it's a standalone lesson and this is what the kids are going to learn, and then the lesson finishes. This one's a little bit trickier because we'd have to focus probably on grammar as a whole, and we'd probably have to have some sort of sequence of learning over the week so that we're building on skills. We wouldn't want to be teaching just about verbs the whole week, because that's probably not a great investment of time when verbs is a very tiny part of a larger content descriptor. But we could say that our focus was grammar and we were going to look at a different element of grammar throughout the week. Your progression could be that you're teaching different elements to the kids throughout the week on the same sort of content, or your progression could be that the tasks are the same. So you might have a task about summarizing in day 1, but your task on day 1 is quite simple, and you build a little bit more skill into it the next day, and you build a little bit more skill into it the next day. Or perhaps earlier in the week, to show your progression of learning, you know, if we think about that gradual release model, we've got a lot of guidance and a lot of modeling, say, early in the week, leading to, say, more independent tasks by the end of the week. So that's what they mean by the progression of learning. So making the skills harder and making the kids more independent at what they can do over the course of the unit. So we need to show evidence of creating a range of modes for each week, specifically speaking, listening, reading and viewing and writing modes in the English domain for provision of critical reflection, to show evidence of inclusion and anti-bias thinking. So this one is not as straightforward as the lesson plan, where we could just choose to say that this was a reading lesson or this was a writing lesson. This time we're working across the different modes. So it's going to be really helpful because it'll give us exposure to the 3 different modes within the Victorian curriculum, and then you'll get to see how they work. Some of them are a little bit tricky with their wording, so it's always good to have a play around with those content descriptors and choosing ones that are relevant to each other. We do have the reading lesson and the writing lesson, so there'll be 2 sort of different focuses within your 2-hour literacy block. I know this sounds probably like a very lot of information, but again, it's just a little overview just to get you thinking about perhaps maybe what year level you'd like to choose, and having a play with the Victorian curriculum yourself, which I'll go through with you very shortly. The planning document will communicate how to use information. So we're going to make connections to ICT, as well as to enhance the teaching of so reading and writing, obviously. You're going to provide a brief statement for ethical and the safe use of ICT. We've got assessment, we've got resources, and we've got curriculum frameworks all need to be included. So as you can see, you're not going to be terribly detailed in what that leaves you for your actual unit plan itself. So we will have practice together writing what needs to go in your unit plan and trying to make that really succinct. Now, the last one, I haven't had too much of a chance to have a think about how this could look. So if you guys have got any ideas, let me know, because it is due in week 13 and it is a presentation of some sort of parent resource kit. So this is a long way away, so we'll have plenty of time to have lots of brainstorms and things about how this particular one could look. So we're making a presentation, but we're also submitting this parent resource kit and an essay that explains what's in the kit. It needs to include two examples of age-appropriate quality literature, so reading, connections to reading there and reading text. 2 ideas for writing that could be given to parents. So a parent resource, we'll talk about what it could look like, what parents could use. And 2 ICT resources. Now, obviously, ICT resources are also going to be literacy based, because everything in this parent resource kit is going to help the kids at home with literacy. Again, we need to provide a critical reflection, which is evident of, again, inclusion and anti-bias thinking. So we'll be used to that because we've also talked about a critical reflection in assessment 1 and assessment 2. We do need to present these. So it's a 3 to 5 minute presentation in that last week. And I really hope we're in person then so we can see all your fabulous presentations. I'm going to spend a little bit more time myself thinking about how this one is going to look, what kinds of things we could put in there, what it would mean to parents and what kind of things parents would like, and probably very relevant at the moment with a lot of homeschooling going on, particularly for little ones, which can be extra hard when they're first just learning to read. So we'll have a think about what we could include in there. All right, I'm just going to ask you guys quickly. I don't know if you want to just jump on and let me know, or just pop it in the chat if you don't feel like talking, but I'd love to do a quick little rating because, you know, I'm new to you guys. I don't want to be either going too fast or too slow. So can you guys, just for my first question, how do you guys feel about lesson planning using content descriptors? Have you used the content descriptors before? Maybe just give yourself a rating out of 10. So Rach. So I've got about a 5 to 9 range. Beautiful. So most people have had a bit of experience using content descriptors before. Excellent. How do you feel about, I only had 1 placement in school. All right, cool. Thanks, Jess. So it seems like everyone's used them. We just maybe need to tailor it a little bit more to literacy in particular. How do you feel about the pedagogical approaches? So when we're talking about how to teach literacy and all those different ways you can teach it, we're going to have a look at it today. We're going to go off and do some research into that. Okay, so we've got about a 5 to 9 range, 5 to 8 range. Perfect. All right, how do you guys feel about differentiating your lessons? Oh, terrific, good. We don't need to talk too much about differentiation. All right, what do you know about the teaching of phonics? How would you rate yourself out of 10? Okay, well, good. That's probably one we can spend a little bit more time on. Terrific. Very good. And what about exposure to teaching of writing? How do you teach writing? All right, so writing we feel a little bit more confident on, not everyone. Okay, awesome. All right, thanks guys. That was really good for me to see just where people are at, so we know where we can focus our time. All right, let's have a look at the Victorian curriculum. Is my little link going to work? Probably not. Let's see if I can get that. Take it here and just pop it here. All right, so in the Victorian curriculum, let's have a look at English. If you haven't had a look at the English curriculum before, when you click on English and it brings up rationale and aims and structure, these are actually really helpful in being able to understand not only the different strands but modes, as in modes being reading, writing and speaking and listening, but then also, they've got strands of reading, writing and speaking and listening, different to the Australian curriculum, and the modes of language, as well as literature and as well as literacy. So it's sort of broken down into ways. Our strands of reading, strand of writing, strand of speaking and listening, and then it's broken down into the content descriptors that relate to language, the content descriptors that relate to literacy, and the content descriptors that relate to literature here. The way I try to remember the different modes is that when we think about language, it's the teaching of, particularly with writing, we have a look here, these are the different substrands. So it's more about the structure and I suppose if we think about the syntactical part of writing and reading, so the actual language itself, phonics comes under here because it's the teaching of the language. So we've got things in here like, a lot of the language outcomes seem to be quite historically based. So a lot of them connect to things like, how is our language different to other languages? How is a lot of reading outcomes connect to things like, how does connections in our world relate to, say, other things, and making connections to different stories and different authors. We also have to learn how to interact with language and understand that now, even though these are grade foundation and 1 and 2, they'll still be able to understand that language is, I suppose the socio-cultural aspects of language, and that it's a social, socio-cultural construct, which is just a fancy word of saying we use language in different settings, we use language in different ways, and that when we write, it's a particular kind of language to when we speak to people. And kids start to learn that there's different elements of formality in your own writing, and that your writing needs to sound different to how you speak to people. So the more social side of writing. There's text structure and organisation, talking about a lot of investigation into good authors and how good authors use sentence structure and figurative language and different, adjectives and adverbs to describe particular settings, breaking down all of those elements of language and how good authors use different elements of language to enhance their own writing. And then getting kids to do that, getting kids to use these same strategies. It's really powerful when you can get a really great book. I really love teaching writing like that, where you get a book as your model or sort of mentor text, and you use that to say, look what the author did here with this particular sentence. Look at the way they've structured this. If we move this around, does that still sound the same? Why did the author choose the word wearily here? What does that word mean? So really investigating language and the structure of language, as well as learning it themselves through their own grammar and sentence structure of their own writing. Literature strands really beautiful because it's all about those really great texts, and I love being able to choose really great texts for the kids and thinking about, you know, text selection is so important when you talk about literacy learning, both for reading and showing the kids good authors for writing. So being able to examine literature, even from, you'll be surprised at how good foundation kids can get at looking at text and understanding different authors' ideas. Even though they're only little, they'll still be able to examine the story and examine characters and examine the setting, and look at why, you know, it says things in here like, I just moved that chat box over. You know, they learn to compare and appraise the way authors use language and literacy techniques and devices to influence readers. Now, obviously, as you move up the levels, that's going to get obviously more complex, but even at Foundation 1 and 2, we look at text and we look at sentence structure and the way authors, really good authors, write text. The literacy strand is the big one about creating text, and that's where a lot of the writing outcomes are going to come from. So I always say to my students, if you've got one that says create a text about this, create a text about that, it's asking them to write. It wants them to write. So when we're looking at the scope and sequence in a minute, if it says create a text, blah, 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 that means that the students need to be writing. It's a writing outcome. We're lucky in the Victorian curriculum that it is broken down into the strands of reading and writing, because in the Australian curriculum it's not. So it can be quite confusing about what the different content descriptors mean. Let's have a look quickly at the scope and sequence. So scope and sequences are beautiful. They help so much, particularly with literacy, because you can see the progression of learning. Now remember, in our unit planner, it said that we needed to show that progression of learning. So let's have a look at this. So the Victorian curriculum gives us way too many scope and sequences, but as you can imagine, when you are teaching yourself, you'll just select your own particular grade level. You won't need to go through all of them. And what also is brilliant is if you're focusing on foundation, if you're thinking about doing foundation for either your lesson plan or unit plan over the next week or so, you've also got these scope and sequences which lead towards foundation, which the Australian curriculum doesn't give you. So we all know what it's like when kids start in that grade prep grade. And there's going to be kids in there who are not meeting foundation level. Highly likely, there'll be quite a number of them that won't be at foundation yet. So look at these, how you've got these working towards foundation from level A to D. So that's going to give you lots of help with your differentiation of your lesson plan if you need to go back and say, well, what's before foundation? I don't know what they're supposed to know before they get to foundation. So that will help so much with those pre-learning skills. Let's have a look at the PDF for that one, for the modes. It brings up a document like this, which is very text heavy. When you go in and have a look at it yourself, so all I've done is just Googled Victorian curriculum, click on curriculum, click on English. It brought us to here. Click on scope and sequence, scroll down, click on this one here with, and just remember not to click on F7 to 10, but just click on this one here, English mode levels, PDF brings you to this one, and then it brings up a beautiful scope and sequence. Now, this is much easier, I find anyway, than having to look at individual content descriptors, because they're not connected to anything and they don't make sense when they're just in isolation, particularly for your unit planner. So at least we can see with this one about where the journey of learning has headed from foundation all the way through to obviously grade 6. So you can see, for example, let's scroll through, that you can see all of the different content descriptors. I'm going to find the one about phonics. Let's do... My screen's going to freeze, isn't it? So I'm scrolling. Let's choose one from here so it doesn't freeze. No, let's get that much bigger. All right, so if we have a look at creating text, which is the one I was talking about before, here is the foundation level. And it starts off with creating text to explore, record, and report ideas and events using unfamiliar words and beginning writing knowledge. So that's how it looks at foundation level. When we move through the scope and sequence, we can see how the ideas are generally the same, but it gets more complex. So by grade 1, they're still writing short texts, but this time the texts have been specifically noted to us. So we need to start having a look at imaginative and informative text. And this time there needs to be some sort of structure to the words. So in foundation, all we're doing is recording ideas and trying to have a go at familiar words and building that writing knowledge. So just really having a go at attempting to write. By grade 1, there's the expectation that you're using, there's some sort of appropriate text structure. So if you've been starting to have a look at, say, narrative text for imaginative, there'll be some sort of structure to it. So some sort of beginning, some sort of middle, some sort of ending to the story. There's some sentence level grammar. More conscious word choice and spelling and punctuation and appropriate multimodal elements. When we get to grade 2, again, it grows, you can see how it's growing in the skills that it's adding each time. And it's amazing to see how from foundation it started off as really having a go at writing all the way through to grade 6, where it's plan and draft imaginative. They've got informative and persuasive text now. We're choosing and experimenting with text structures, language features, which the students would have been taught about, and images, and having that digital element as well. So the scope and sequence is handy for understanding where your specific content descriptor is going to fit in the whole scheme of learning. If we were going to perhaps choose something like, say, this one, the one here, create a short, imaginative, informative or persuasive text using growing knowledge of text structures and features for our, say, lesson plan, then that would be the one that we'd focus on. But we'd then have a better understanding of where the kids have come from if we have a look at the scope and sequence. Because when we're trying to differentiate, we need to know, you know, even though I've got a grade 2 class sitting in front of me, not everyone is grade 2 level. So the scope and sequence helps me to see, well, this is what they should have been doing in grade 1 and then moving on to grade 2, but there might be still some grade 2s who are still back here or perhaps back here. So the scope and sequence is really handy of knowing how to differentiate for the class in terms of academic ability for those who aren't quite at the level that we're looking at, but also those who can do more. So differentiation is not just about providing tasks for the people who can't do the main task and providing those struggling riders with support. It's also about extension to kids who are able to do more. So they might be working up at some of these content descriptors up here. So even though this is a prep to 2 subject, if you are writing a lesson plan for grade 2, you are still going to have to look at grade 3 outcomes so that you know how to extend those bright kids that will inevitably be in your classroom with you. Going back to the curriculum, I'm going to click on curriculum here and I'm going to get my levels. It's really handy to click on the actual outcomes themselves, because something that I found, and you guys might want to have a play with it this week yourself, is having a look at the elaborations. The elaborations are so helpful because we all know what it's like to work with these curriculums, and sometimes even me, you just scratch your head and you say, well, what do they actually mean by that? What do they mean when they say the language features? What's a language feature? I might know what language features are, but what specifically do they want me to teach? What language features do they want me to focus on? So even experienced teachers will feel like that. So for graduates in particular, it's really important to choose your content descriptors when you're thinking about your lesson plan over the next week or so and what you would like to focus on. Click on your click on the actual unit code itself. So this one here, you'll see that all of them have their specific code. Click on those. So let's choose a good one. Let's choose on. All right, let's have a look at this one here. Recognize that texts are made up of words and groups of words to make meaning. Okay, great. What does that mean? Let's go into here. And here is our content descriptor, but here is the elaboration. So it tells us a little bit more about the outcome. So we've got exploring spoken, written, and multimodal texts and identifying elements, for example, words and images. So it gives you a little bit more about the actual content descriptor itself. Let's choose, maybe this one has a few more. Let's do phonics. Yeah, here we go. So this content descriptor is saying that we're going to teach the kids short vowels, common long vowels, consonant digraphs, and consonant blends. So we need to know what they are. When we have a look at the elaboration, it gives us a little bit more detail. So it's telling us that saying words with the same onset as a given word. So for example, words that begin with d, og, and bl, u, and saying words with the same rhyme as a given word. For example, when words are in like at and pl, a. So this is really handy because now it's given me, if I hadn't have clicked on this elaboration, I wouldn't have known about having this sort of bit more focus on onset and rhyme. So it's given me a little bit more to go on in terms of what this content descriptor actually wants me to teach. Now we're still going to have to do lots of investigating, because in that one, for example, we have to know about short vowels and long vowels and digraphs and what they are to be able to teach them. Just going to have a sip of this. When we talk about phonics, we'll talk about what all of these things are. All right, so if this was me, I would probably start off this week by focusing on what strand I wanted my lesson to be. Probably even a step back from that. Firstly, what year level do you want your lesson plan to be? Choose one specifically. So foundation, year 1 or year 2. what strand do you want it to be, reading and writing, and what mode, what element within that strand are you going to focus on? So will it be a literacy mode, a language mode, or a literature mode? You could have incorporated a few different CDs into your lesson, and that means that you'll have a few different modes. But you need to choose content descriptors that work together and make sense. So we can't have one CD that's about spelling and one CD that's about phonics and one CD that's about, visualizing or comprehension. So we need to make sure that our content descriptors work together. No, it doesn't, Rach, we don't have a lesson plan template, and it doesn't say to do a rationale. So I'm going to say no, but we'll talk more next week about how we envision it looking and making sure that we do have the things that we need to include. But I don't think it needs a rationale. Perhaps your rationale can sort of be summed up by your learning intentions anyway. If you were writing a lesson for school, if I was writing a lesson for school, I wouldn't include what my rationale was. I'd just stick to the learning intentions. Don't have a speaking and listening focus. That's just my tip. It doesn't mean that you can't, but it's hard. So my warning is to choose something that's reading or writing just to make it easier, because in a real life school setting, you wouldn't just teach speaking and listening as a standalone lesson. I understand that sometimes we do things like show and tell, and we do things like oral presentations, but it can be tricky just to do a speaking and listening lesson. Doesn't mean that it can't be done, but it is trickier. So most of the time with my own speaking and listening, when I'm doing assessment in my own grade, I would do a reading lesson and I would choose reading content CDs, and then I could have perhaps a connection to speaking and listening, because I might have a guided reading group and I might ask that particular group to have a discussion with me, and I could assess speaking and listening skills through my guided reading group. I wouldn't teach it. It's not taught as a standalone thing. It's taught in other ways. Rach, did you have something you wanted to ask? Or?
Yes, please.
Go for it.
Sorry. Just because we have quite a few assessments due in week 4, maybe like after class or something, would we be able just to make like a forum where we can maybe just comment what type of template we think we want to use instead of waiting until next week to decide?
Okay, no worries. Let's do that. Okay, so so step 1, choose your grade level. Step 2, choose your strand, reading or writing, and then start thinking about what CDs could fit under that. Now, obviously, this is a foundation to year 2, so the main focus is going to be on decoding if you choose reading, because that's what the main focus is in those grade levels. It doesn't mean to say that you couldn't do some sort of comprehension lesson, or you couldn't add some element of comprehension to your planning, because we absolutely do that in foundation to year 2 as well. They still learn comprehension strategies. I remember being a parent helper in my son's room when he was in grade prep, and it was a beautiful lesson about visualization, which is a comprehension strategy. And even though they're little ones, and even though they've only been at school for a couple of weeks, they really got it. So it doesn't mean to say that comprehension is just something for the, the middle to upper school. It definitely can be worked into your plan as well. All right, let me go back to here. All right, I was going to set a task, but since we would probably be, since we've still got a bit of time, let's let's have a chat about templates, and then we can go back and do this task and perhaps meet back up, say about 12, and have a look at what people came up with for their pedagogical approaches. Let's go back to here. I'm going to take notes on this. So what are you guys thinking? How are you imagining this template is going to work?
I was thinking maybe doing a whole part whole, but I would like to maybe test out like using the gradual release of responsibility, just because I haven't used that all that often.
Yeah, okay. Let's have a look. Or what maybe we could do is let's set our task. You guys can go off and have a work on this, and then I will have time to come up with a template. I reckon we could knock one out. So what we need to make sure of, all right, so let's make sure it's got learning intentions. Writing learning intentions can sometimes be tricky, but it's basically based on whatever CD you've chosen. So we need curriculum outcomes in there. Curriculum outcomes. Now, all your reflection and all those little bits are going to be written separate. So that's not going to be in this particular template. Let's go back. All right, so we need, what else do we need? So we'll have like year level, strand, and then your modes and your CDs. So it's really specific choice. What else do we need to include? Okay. Now, it says to use theoretical frameworks and provide provisions for differentiation, but we'll make sure that we've weaved that into the body of the lesson. Sometimes when I think you just list what your pedagogical approaches are, it doesn't really make sense in the context of what you're trying to teach. So we'll have our lesson structure as some sort of opener or introduction, which will be your modeled lesson. And that's already connecting to pedagogical approaches. You'll have some sort of independent or guided tasks that the kids go off and do. And then you'll have some sort of reflection. Now, we're not going to see too much gradual release just in the individual lesson itself. That will be more relevant to when we do our unit planner. All right, so the differentiation needs to be built into the lesson itself. So within the independent task, for example, you'd need to show that you've got more than one activity taking place. Oh, an assessment, of course. So we'll need something even earlier on. So you'll need a pre-assessment. It's always good to have some sort of assessment during, even if it's just a really sort of brief, formative, you know, give me a, you know, thumbs up if you understand what you're doing. So there'll be some sort of midway. In the Western region, there is a framework for literacy that actually asks you to do like a little check-in sort of midway through the lesson and just reiterate what the learning intentions are and make sure that kids are on track. So that, say if they were doing half an hour of independent work, you would check in, say, halfway through and just check in again with the learning intentions and make sure that kids understood what they were doing. So you sort of had a midpoint assessment, and then something that you were going to use as an assessment at the end. But it could just be, it doesn't mean that you have to do something formal, but it could just be that you're assessing perhaps whatever work was produced in that independent reading time. Questions? Yep. Helpful prompts? Yep. Thanks, Jess. Questions? Yeah, so your teacher approach is your pedagogy, is your how. How are you going to teach it? How are you going to do it? So remember, if we have a look, we can even have a look later at some of the hits, so the high impact teaching strategies. So it's always important to have things like worked examples. So yeah, modeling. So you need to show the students what it is that you want them to produce. So that will be part of your modeling in your introduction. All right, terrific. I will put that together in some sort of template that I think looks reasonably straightforward, because too many headings and too many different boxes gets ultra confusing. All right, guys, I'm going to set you a task, and then we can get off these computer screens for a little bit, have a bit of a break, and then come back later. Now I have put this in Moodle, but if you want to just take a little screenshot or you want to just jot down those couple of little things for me, that would be great. Otherwise it is in Moodle. And the link to the literacy toolbox is there as well.
Just so you're aware, I think we have another class at 1.
At 1 o'clock?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yep.
All right, so if I click on Literacy Toolkit, it doesn't want to work again. Let's pop it here. Have you guys seen the Literacy Toolkit before? This one? If you haven't, it's great. So definitely bookmark it. Yeah, it's really good. And the New South Wales one is really good too if you get stuck for ideas. Even though they've got a different set of curriculum outcomes, they do have just really helpful guides and things like that to teaching. And, you know, even though we're in different states, the actual approaches to teaching reading are not going to change from state to state. So the Literacy Toolkit is really helpful because it goes through different levels. So we're going to choose Foundation to Year 6. And you can see here already that it's got reading and viewing and writing, speaking and listening and other elements of literacy. So I'm going to go into reading and viewing, and I'm going to go into teaching practices. And these are the practices that we're going to have a little investigation into today. So what I want you to do for me in the next, say, hour is firstly have a break, but then come back to your computer and choose one of these for me. So either choose modelled reading, shared reading, guide reading, or independent reading. Now, you will notice here that there's reciprocal teaching, things like literacy, language experience, we're not going to do today, but there's literacy circles and closed reading. The reason why I haven't chosen any of those is besides language experience, reciprocal reading and literacy circles is for middle to upper primary. So we're not going to worry about those. So just choose one of these things to focus on: modelled, shared, guided, or independent. Click in and it takes you through what modelled reading is and the theories. So what elements of modelling or what concepts can be modelled, the importance of modelled reading, the theory behind modelled reading, and how you implement it. So within this particular website, it gives you all of the answers to these questions. So these are the things that I want you to just have a think about. You can take notes and we'll just come back and have a share, and then we'll have a look at the lesson plan we've come up with. So what is the approach? Is it for a small group or a whole grade? How is it implemented and how does it fit into the gradual release model? So just a couple of quick questions there about what your approach is and just basically how it works. So how are we going to When this is a provide example data, it would be like a sort of a pretend analysis of where the kids have come from in terms of your assessment and differentiation. So yeah, I'll explain more about that when I show you whatever lesson plan we come up with, right? All right, so choosing one, modelled, shared, guided, or independent. Which one, tell me about it. What is it? How does it work? Is it for a small group or is it for the whole grade? How do you do it? And how does it fit into gradual release? So just a couple of questions I want you to jot down. And then when we come back, we'll just have a talk about each of those and what's special about them and where do you use them in your lesson plan. And then I will come up with a brilliant lesson plan template for us. I don't know how brilliant it's going to be, but it will be workable. And then you'll have that to start thinking about over the week about what you want your lesson to look like. So jot them down. They are in Moodle. So if you can't remember what they were, you don't need to answer those questions specifically. They were just more just to give you some focus to your thinking, but have a look at one approach and tell me some things about it. Should we meet back? I know that the class finishes at 12:30. Should we meet back at 11:30? Does that sound okay? 11:30? And we'll just have a share and a share of lesson plan. Sounds good. All right, terrific. If you, I hope you guys aren't too overwhelmed. Do you feel overwhelmed so far? It is week one in the first hour, so yeah, please, yeah, okay, good. Just didn't know if we did too much talking about that. So, all right, terrific. Yeah, that's okay, Kate. We'll talk about that when we come back with the lesson plan. All right, terrific. So let's meet back here in the same Zoom call at 11:30. Thanks, guys. Let's resume. This is what I've been playing with for the last hour, so you guys can see what you think. So basically what I've done is I've tried to put in the things from our little lesson overview. But again, it's just sort of an example of how it could look. We could add things now, change things, let me know what you guys are thinking. So starting off with obviously like the title, so just whether it's about conjunctions, whether it's about grammar, whether it's comprehension based, just give it a little title. All of our lesson plans are an hour, so that's already in there. Starting off with learning intentions and success criteria probably makes the most sense, because if that's how you were going to do it in the classroom, that's how you would format it. Try to use language that is accessible to students. So if you're using learning intentions and success criteria, I always word mine, because they always go in the whiteboard so that kids can access them too, so that your perhaps midpoint assessment could be something where you talk about the learning intentions again that you've already highlighted at the beginning of the lesson. Kids will talk about them when you're doing your reflections. So I always try and have mine in language that's friendly to students, whether you've got, say, I can statements like, I can use two shorter sentences with a conjunction to make a complex sentence. So something that the students can do by the end of the lesson. And then obviously the success criteria is there to measure their level of success with the task. So they should be able to know if they have met the criteria. And that's all important in terms of your reflection. I've just popped over here year level, so you could say foundation 1 or 2, whatever literacy curriculum strand you're using, whether it's reading or writing. And then I've got modes in there, but I'm not really sure if we need to have that, because that will be covered by whatever content descriptor you choose. You might have one, you might have more. If you do have more than one, then you need to make sure that your content descriptors are related to each other and they would fit logically within the same lesson. So you wouldn't have, say, like one that relates to spelling or handwriting mixed in with one that related to learning phonics and blends. So we need to make sure that I just usually stick to one. I've been having a long think about this pre-assessment and how we can make it make sense when we don't actually have any concrete data ourselves. So it's not like we're going to be able to go off and actually have kids in front of us and do any of this pre-assessment. So it's going to be hypothetical, or what you would actually look for if you were to do a pre-assessment. So let me show you an example. Where's my little screenshot? Let me see, I'm just going to stop sharing for a sec so I can show you a photo. And I'll just start sharing again. Share screen. This one. So in this one that I just took a photo of quickly just to show you guys, this would be an example of, say, a pre-assessment you can do. Now, granted, it is grade 3, which is a little bit out of what we are meant to be doing, but as an example, this is how it could look. So you're not going to have a real student that you're going to be sitting in front of to actually get real data out of. But the idea is that you just mention what your pre-assessment would be and then what elements of literacy you would be looking for. You're not going to have this real data. But as an example, I was doing an inferential comprehension assessment. I decided to choose a small text so I could justify in my brief analysis that I want to only focus on inference. So I don't want to focus on other comprehension strategies. I just wanted to focus on inference because that's what the kids are learning. So in my brief analysis or brief explanation in my pre-assessment, I could say that I've made up my own, or I've found my own small part of text, and I just want the kids to show me what they know about how they infer. Then from my teaching point of view, the things I were looking for, so when I gathered all of those assessments up, what things am I looking for? Now, I already know what I'm looking for even before the students hand this to me. So the fact that we don't have any real students doing this and giving us real data shouldn't matter too much, because what I'm looking for is the fact that they can connect to evidence in the text. So I already knew I was looking for that. So when I do my assessment, are the kids connecting to evidence in the text? Are they able to connect to unfamiliar vocab that shows that they have a connection to, you know, those deeper levels of inferring? Are they able to evaluate? So are they able to draw their own conclusions, but then look for evidence in the text? So I already knew I was looking for those things. So in my box on my lesson plan, I'm going to share a different screen, this one. This one here. So if I was doing the CD, which is a grade 1 curriculum descriptor, so understand that simple connections can be made between using a compound sentence with 2 or more clauses, usually linked by a coordinating conjunction. So if that was my CD I was going to have in my lesson, I would be looking for pre-assessment data from them. So my pre-assessment could just be that I'm using a story or giving them a pre-writing task to see if they're doing any level of complex sentences there. Are they sticking to simple sentences? Are they using any forms of conjunctions whatsoever to connect sentences together? So I could just say that I'm looking for some sort of writing sample, and these are the things that I am looking for. We even had And like assessment can come in all sorts of different forms. Just going to show you one more photo. This one here. It doesn't always just have to be concrete sort of testing data. We even had things like this little, we had a bump it up wall, and we said that a good piece of writing would have a simple sentence with a noun and a verb. A great piece of writing can have 2 sentences. They're related, but they're not joined. And I can write 2 simple sentences. Amazing moved on to I can use conjunctions of 2 simple sentences, and then super became I can use precise conjunctions to join 2 simple sentences. So that was the progression of learning. So kids could even do some sort of pre-assessment where they look at their own work and decide where they go in between those different criteria. Just going to jump. Yeah, absolutely, Rach. If you've got some data, or if you've got access to getting kids that could provide you with some real data, it could be easier. But otherwise, you're going to have to think about it as a hypothetical situation. Let's jump back to the lesson plan. So if I wanted to test kids on conjunctions, these are the things I would be looking for in a test. Maybe you could even link to, if you are going to give them some sort of little pre-assessment, perhaps you can attach it as a little appendix here to show me what your pre-assessment would look like. And then you just say, why are you choosing it? Why has this become your pre-assessment? What is it going to tell you? And that's what the brief analysis is about. What is it going to tell you? All right, my template's all fallen over. That was joined up. I'll fix that up. We've got resources and activities. Let's make that just resources because our activities are going to go below. So any resources that you think would be relevant to the lesson. And then here's the most important part. So the body of the lesson. So we've got step 1 is your model or explicit instruction. And this is where you're going to be modeling or using perhaps worked examples. So a worked example is where you yourself do the task as the teacher and you step the kids through how you've actually done it using an example that they can then look at. And very much so modeling of explicit skills. So if I want to teach my kids I've got grade 1s, so far they're just using simple sentences, and I would like to model for them how I'm going to use or convert 2 simple sentences into a complex sentence using some form of conjunction. So I'm going to show them how to do that, model that for them. For those people who did modeled reading, let's talk about reading. I've given a lot of writing examples. When we talk about modeled reading, what's some of the things that we found out about it? Jump on, type it in chat. What was important about modeled reading? Is it whole grades, small group? Where does it fit into the gradual release? Probably this part of the lesson's kind of giving it away a little bit. So if you decide to do a modeled or a shared reading, that's going to go at the very beginning because it's the start of the gradual release model. Yeah, maximum support to the student, excellent. So this is where the students are going to need that maximum support. So high level of teacher input for those explicit modeling and those exampled. If you decide to do I reckon modeled reading works best probably for a lesson format like this. If you want to do shared reading, that's okay too, but you have to remember that it's that shared format and whether that suits the CD that you're trying to teach to. If you have a think about your CDs during the week and you want me to have a look at them next week, then definitely bring them in and let me know maybe which one you were thinking and if you need any help sort of thinking of lesson ideas to do with that too. So if we're going from maximum support, we're then moving on to providing the kids with an opportunity to go off and do it themselves, which is why worked examples are nice, and it's become part of that high impact teaching strategies, is because kids have something to look at. Kids have something to say, oh yeah, I can see this is what the teacher did and I'm going to try and do the same. I do have some examples of that for you, but I'll leave them for next week, and we can have a look at how you move into this guided and independent learning. What did people find out about independent and guided reading? What were some of the keys to it? Independent reading can be a bit of a bugbear with some people because the kids don't get enough structure. So even though the kids are learning independently, we need to make sure that we've still got the same focus for them.
So when I was on placement and we had our reading sessions, they would go into their allocated groups, like support, middle and advanced, of course. And so like the teacher would take a small group onto the mat, and then the other group, say, would be doing reading to somebody.
Yeah.
And then the advanced group would be doing whatever is for them. And so at the end of the lesson on the floor, she makes them all accountable. And then before we move to the next section, she would ask the students that were reading to each other to tell me one thing you learn about from the book.
Yeah, terrific. It's a good way to keep them accountable, isn't it?
Yeah. But like I just found that most of them just mucked around when they were doing their reading to each other.
Yeah.
And I don't think they were really reading. They would just tell each other something. They were so sneaky.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing that you have to be careful of. And, you know, independent reading or independent tasks can be tricky like that because, you know.
So I was thinking for my lesson plan of doing foundations with rhyming words.
Yep.
So phonics and all that sort of stuff. And hold on, I've got to go back to my thing because I don't even know what I wrote in it. So I basically set it up how I did my lesson plans for another class. So I had my like learning intention, success criteria, previous assessments, resource materials, curriculum links, and then I have a warm up, which is a rhyming word game / YouTube clip. So the children have to watch the clip and they have to stand up if it's correct and sit down if it doesn't match.
Yeah. Sounds good.
And then, then I move into different stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that little sort of warm-up engagement, that's a great idea to sort of get them.
It makes them accountable because they have to watch the screen because he'll say the words and then you have to stand up if he's right or sit down if he's wrong.
Yeah, that's gorgeous. Love that. Yeah, sounds good. So in this middle bit, just remember, as we were just discussing there, that we need to differentiate the tasks. So make sure that you do have those different abilities covered, academic abilities. Then we've got the conclusions. So we want to be able to wrap up the lesson. I know at my school we do a pivot survey, which is where the kids get to rate you on your teaching, which is very eye-opening. And I remember this needing to be one of my focus. So, you know what it's like in the classroom, you're always so time poor. And I was always like, oh, we'll just have a quick reflection. But it's actually really important to wrap up the lesson properly and reconnect to whatever the focus was and talk to the kids about the learning intentions and have that I've wrote end of lesson assessment, but let's put it back here. Like, do we want, there might not necessarily be something you want at the end, but there could possibly be something you want the kids to hand in to you so that you've got something to assess, or I'll just put a question mark there, whether they're going to submit something to you for then you to reflect on in your own time. Now, as a part of the lesson, we do have to have a lesson reflection. Apologies about my bird. So I've added it in here, but whether you want it in your actual lesson plan, you might want to have it on a separate page. It's completely up to you, but I have put it here just in case you don't mind using it here. And I've just put a few questions that I thought might be relevant to a reflection. So things like, how well does this lesson teach the CD? Because if you're critically reflecting on your own lesson, does it meet the CD that we were trying to teach? Does it teach to the learning intentions? Do they match up? Is it assessment effective? You know, have you touched on assessment at different points in the lesson? Is it inclusive of all abilities? Have you been able to differentiate there? And is it driven by data? So you just need to say at the very beginning of the lesson that you've used some sort of data to drive where this lesson is coming from, and that you've used effective assessment. Can you guys think of anything else? Can you think of anything else that would need to go in there? I'll have to fix up the formatting before I send it to you. Yeah, content descriptors and curriculum descriptors are the same. I think it's just, yeah. Let's change them to curriculum. That might make more sense. Let's see, here we go. All right. So what we'll do next week is, if everyone can go and probably just have a little reflect about, I guess, what year level you would like to choose if you haven't had to think about that already, what you really want your main focus to be on, whether you want it to be reading or writing, and then pick some content descriptors if you want me to have a look at them and see what you could do, or do we need to match them up better? That's a great question. Do we need time for each step? Some people may do. We can probably play that by ear over the next couple of weeks. If you want to get started and you feel comfortable starting, and you think that you could perhaps have a draft together by next week, but some other people might feel like they need a little bit more time looking at each of the different elements, we'll just play it by ear and just see what people need. Maybe for next week, we can talk about our content for an hour and then leave the rest of the session just catching up with individuals and giving some feedback on how the lesson plan's looking so far.
In previous lessons, we've had to say how long like a certain thing in our lesson plan would go for. I think that's what Tarina's trying to say. Like
yeah.
one time for it.
I get you now. It doesn't say that we need to. If you think that will help you plan the lesson out, then you can do it. It doesn't say, yeah, I know what you mean. So you're saying like introduction 10 minutes, body of, guided reading 20 minutes. If it helps you to stick to your 60 minutes, you could pop them in, but you don't have to as far as the assessment, like rubric and things like that are concerned. I do have the rubric for you too, which I'll send off to you today. Yeah, and then we can have a closer look if there's anything else we need to include. All right, I'm conscious of the fact that you guys have got another class. Is there any other questions or things you want to talk about? Otherwise, we'll finish up for the day before you guys have got your next lesson. Oh, rubrics on Moodle, awesome. Thanks, Rach. I only got handed these things myself a few days ago, so I have to have a look too. All right, I'll hang around for a bit if you want to ask me some more questions. Otherwise, I'll let you guys go and I'll see you next Thursday. I'm not sure if we'll be in person, but potentially. All right, thanks everyone. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, so annoying. I did move him down the other end of my house, and then my kids have the bright idea to bring him back again. Thanks, guys. Thanks a lot. I brought him to school with me, but he was just too noisy at school too. I couldn't concentrate there either.
Thank you. See you next week.
See you guys. See you next week.
I just want to make sure that, so you're okay with us using different templates and stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I've literally just made that one up. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I do have like a whole one, but then I don't know if it would be best to cover, I guess, what this assessment task is asking.
You've got my
Yeah, cool. As long as you're okay with like different templates. and
yeah.
stuff.
You've got my email, yeah? My new I think it's in the course thing.
Yeah, I think so.
If you want to send me something and you want me to have a look, go for it, Rach.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thanks, Rach. Thanks for your help too with getting me started. Oh yeah. I really